Following the reception from the most overrated items video, as well as a suggestion from a comment, I've decided to make a most underrated items in round video. So it's probably wise that you prepare yourself for another round of potentially hot takes. Like the last video, I'm basing how underrated an item is off of my own experience, opinions I've seen, my own opinion, and for some items how early on you can get it and how useful it is from that point up to later stages of the game. With all of that in mind, the first item that I don't think gets the love it deserves is the Battle God Seal. This item alone has made my Paladin experience extremely enjoyable for the simple reason of neuron activation from high numbers. There's probably a decent amount of people that don't know how the item works or that it even exists, so allow me to bless you with this knowledge real quick. It's essentially a seal that sacrifices the health and health regeneration aspect of most seals and focuses on extremely high bursts of damage, assuming you're able to stay above 50%, and if not, you get armor for 3 seconds, which is pretty nice. Keep in mind you can double buff with a tiered seal and then this one for the damage buff, but the MP cost is probably pretty high if you're trying to do that consistently. As I said earlier, the focal point of the seal is the absolutely gargantuan attack boost it gives. For 0.6 seconds it gives you plus 150 attack. With the Colo, I'm able to get 2 shots without Berserk in, and they hit for around 1.7 to 2k each, and with a pretty short cooldown of 2 seconds, you're able to get the high burst damage pretty often. It shines especially with Divinity as the beam scale with attack. As you can see here, I was hitting for around 4.5k with the beams, but the timing can be kind of janky, so it's something you will have to practice with. I honestly think it is like top 3 Agent of Oryx abilities, or at the very least up there with things like Rage Claws, Buckler, Orb, and the Bisque Skull. All Agent of Oryx abilities are seasonal, but when there are events for these shards, you can usually get a boatload as it's relatively easy to get them. You should definitely cop this seal if you have 30 shards laying around. Trust me, it's actually really good and genuinely fun to use. Following up with another ability that I especially slept on is the Ballistic Star. It's probably one of the most unorthodox abilities in the game, which says a lot because items like these are in existence. My explanation for the item itself is probably going to be trash, so there will be a clip on screen showing what it looks like. It throws 2 sets of 4 stars, the inner set inflicting stun on enemies but also giving healing for 4 seconds. The range of the stars that stun is 1.5, which sounds unappealing, but when you use it correctly it isn't that much of an issue. It truly shines in scenarios where there are enemies that chase you, which is fairly often, or if you're in a small group without a priest or a paladin and want to increase the survivability of the ninja. For example, if you're in a halls and dragging a crusade, it shreds them relatively fast and you're able to stun the commander pretty safely as you're just kiting backwards constantly. The same type of logic can be applied to a lot of enemies in the game. So like I was saying earlier, hitting the stun is nowhere near as difficult as it may seem to be. Something noteworthy is that the healing does not have a cooldown, so you can just keep 100% uptime as long as you have enough mana. I think most people shy away from using the ability purely because it seems so weird to use, but just because it's unorthodox doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. You just have to be creative, for lack of a better word, when using it. In scenarios where it seems usable, it excels. Soul's Guidance is probably the item on this list that surprised me the most. For how easy it is to get the weapon, it is disgustingly good, even more so after its somewhat recent buffs. More and more people are catching on to how good the weapon is, but I do still feel like it is mad slept on. Every time you shoot, it has a 15% chance with a 0.4 second cooldown to release a soul. The souls last 8 seconds and do 500 damage over 5 seconds. After 5 they kinda just fuck off, blow up and inflict curse. The wand itself, not accounting for the souls, has 20 average damage below T12 but has a wavy shot pattern, but I didn't really have any difference in my ability to aim it. Unfortunately, the DPS calculator that I use doesn't account for the damage that the souls do, but a friend was nice enough to calculate the DPS that they add. With 79 dexterity and in a period of 5 seconds, I was able to spawn an average of 6 souls. Not accounting for any dex buffs, debuffs, including the curse from the wand itself, it adds about an extra 550 DPS to the wand, putting it above the T14 wand in damage while dropping from a relatively easy dungeon and being easy to forge. Now with Berserk, debuffs and exalts, I've come to the extremely astute observation that the wand deals a decent amount of damage. The last thing I want to talk about isn't necessarily one item, but rings as a whole that aren't focused exclusively on DPS. This section is kind of just me rambling, so do take what I say here with a grain of salt. I feel like the rings that don't provide an abundance of DPS stats are fairly undervalued. Rings such as Sourstone, Crystallized Mist, and this one is probably the hot take of the video, Omni. Somehow I still see a fair amount of people calling Omni bad, and I don't really understand how. Mist provides 60 HP, 6 defense, and a sizable H speed, which are all stats that help with survivability. Its proc, which makes you invisible for 8 seconds on a 45-second cooldown, is insanely useful. It is by far the best ring for rushing, and it can help you avoid situations that would lead to your death, but I don't really hear many people talking about it. If you go through the list of UT rings, you can notice a trend that anything that doesn't have a bunch of DPS stats isn't talked about much, if at all, regardless of survivability it adds. But I guess the DPS meta is bound to be prevalent in any PvE game, so it does make sense. But I do think a variation of rings that don't provide just damage and do other things should definitely be added. Even Omni, which totals to 8 DPS stats, seems to be utterly overshadowed by rings like Crown. Don't get me wrong, I think Crown is an absolutely amazing ring, but I'd personally rather trade the 4 DPS stats and 30 HP that Crown gives for everything that Omni does on like 90% of classes. But that's just my opinion. As I said earlier, you should probably take everything I said here with a grain of salt, because I think this is by far the weakest part of the video. I've said pretty much everything I've wanted to, so if you enjoyed the video, a like would be much appreciated, and make sure to enjoy the rest of your day or night.